Welcome everyone, thank you all for being here. I'm going to call this special meeting of our Town Plan and Zoning Commission to order. It is Tuesday, May 10th at 7:13 p.m. So my name is Rob Klee. I'm the chair of our Woodbridge Plan and Zoning Commission. Other members with us here tonight are Yoni Zamir, Andrew Skolnick, Jeff Kennedy, and Kathy Hunter. Thank you all for joining. We do have a quorum tonight. We are, as usual, ably supported by Chris Sullivan and Pua Ford. And we're meeting here in person, which is nice. So it's, again, nice to see all of you, though we are masked today because of my, I won't go, we're recording this, so I won't go into that. Our agenda tonight is on the town website, and the only item on our agenda tonight actually is an informational presentation and discussion with attorney Daniel Glissman, who is the co-chair of the Connecticut Bar Association's Committee on Cannabis Law. So this presentation will be recorded and uploaded to the town website, and it will serve actually as a resource for the public and for other town committees as we as a town explore our options with respect to the retail sale of cannabis. So Attorney Glissman, welcome. Thank you for being here and perhaps introducing yourself for the record and telling us a little bit about your background before we get into your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me this evening. Again, for the record, my name is Dan Glissman. I'm an attorney with the law firm McDermott, Reynolds & Glissman. We're based out of Hartford. I have been representing folks in the cannabis industry for nearly a decade now. I got my start right after out of law school, more or less, working in Massachusetts. I was fortunate enough to work with a partner at my former firm to license and permit the first medical marijuana dispensary in downtown Boston. And after that success, we sort of built a niche practice group there in Massachusetts. That was 2014, 2015. And of course, Massachusetts legalized adult use cannabis in 2016. And so the practice naturally expanded. We went on to represent several clients in the medical space in Massachusetts. And then again, I was lucky enough to work with the group that was the first to open for adult use sales in Massachusetts. So it was the first adult use sales east of the Mississippi. It was pretty neat. But you know, I've licensed and permitted probably 100 or more cannabis establishments, largely in Massachusetts. Although I'm a native of Connecticut, and I've been back in Connecticut for 3 years now, really tracking and following the cannabis legislation as it made its fits and starts through the legislature, just having passed last year. And I'll get into this a little bit more detail in my presentation, but most recently, we've been doing a ton of work on the licensing side in Connecticut, some sort of local municipal permitting, but I think the wave of local municipal permitting is still to come. But yeah, that's a little bit about my background. And obviously here tonight to give you folks an overview of what the adult use cannabis program in Connecticut looks like, how it's operating, and really the discussion is focused around the bill that was signed into law last summer and has been sort of in process and progressing over these last 8 months. Really have been sort of the critical time for cannabis here in Connecticut. So if you flip just to the very first page, I want to start with just a little bit of a background here. So cannabis is not necessarily new to Connecticut. Connecticut's had a pretty robust medical program for several years now. What you can see on this first page is just a sort of a map showing the existing dispensary facilities, which are the medical-only facilities. We have 18 in the state, and then the green dots are the producers, the cultivation facilities. There are 4 of those in the state. There's a very large multi-state operator presence in Connecticut. Some of the bigger operators across the country, Curaleaf, Acreage, GTI, Trulieve, Verano. Those are some of the bigger names, and they've come in and purchased their way into the Connecticut marketplace over the last 5 years or so. So yeah, Connecticut's medical program, very robust, been in existence for several years now, and operates, largely without issue. And and the program is touted as one of the best in the nation. We have a heavy focus on, the medical benefits, if you will, and just the medical draw to cannabis. And you have to have a licensed pharmacist on site. So it's a very medical focused program, as it should be, as medical marijuana. So the next page, I'm talking about now getting into adult use. So the adult use bill passed last summer created 9 new license types for cannabis, and I've sort of laid them out here with some little bullet points on what the various license types offer. But I'll just kind of tick through them and give you guys a little bit of feedback on each license type. So the first and probably most commonly thought about cannabis type is the adult use retailer. This is specifically adult use only, no medical sales, no discounts or other inducements to medical patients to sort of draw them to the adult use side. And an important piece that some of you may have seen on the news, the law was very specific about sort of the rules around gifting and, can you provide a T-shirt for $25 in exchange for, some amount of cannabis. And there has been some of that in Connecticut over the last 6 months or so, and a recent bill that was just passed by the legislature and yet to be signed into law is tamping down on that further. So we have always said that that's not a practice that's authorized under state law, but people have seen it as a bit of a loophole, which the legislature has since closed. The next license type is the hybrid retailer. That is specifically to cover both adult use and medical marijuana sales. So the existing 18 dispensary facilities that we just identified on the prior slide, all those facilities have the right to convert to a hybrid retailer. They, of course, have to go through some level of licensing and permitting, but they can convert to be able to sell adult use and continue on as medical sales. Couple of points, just that they have to really maintain their medical program. So they have to have a licensed pharmacist on premises. They have to have private consultation space. They have to be open a certain number of hours a week, presumably to make sure there's accessibility by the patients. The next is the micro cultivator. So this is really a smaller scale cultivation facility, anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 square feet of canopy. So that's actually the space where the cannabis is grown, not necessarily the entire building size. And we often, when you're thinking about this from a real estate perspective, typically the quote-unquote canopy space is about half of the size of a building. So if you have a 20,000 square foot, warehouse that's going to be repurposed as a cannabis facility, you might see that size building fitting this micro cultivator category because it's between 2 and 10,000 square feet. The micro cultivator is also a very neat license type because the state has authorized it to expand every year by 5,000 square feet. So sort of, I guess, seen as a little bit more of an entry-level grow operation as compared to some of the larger scale facilities that we'll get into in a moment. One important note here is that these 3 license types, including the micro cultivator, they have the authority to deliver to customers under the state statute until there are 5 delivery services that are licensed. And then once those delivery services are up and running, then they have to utilize the delivery companies.
A quick question. Do you mind if we ask some questions?
No. Yeah, please.
As we burst
ahead.
here. And is that delivery service and sort of on demand? It's like Grubhub for.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, obviously the companies still have to, ID check folks and confirm 21 plus for adult use consumers. But yeah, it's sort of, they call it the Uber Eats style delivery program, where the delivery facilities, when they're separate entities and operating, they're not going to be storing the cannabis at their facility. They're going to be driving to the retailer, and delivering to the retailer's customer, if you will. So it's more of it's similar to Uber Eats, where if you order McDonald's, the delivery driver picks it up and brings it to you. So
So it wouldn't be a retailer that had no public facing, it was only doing delivery. This is only a service of the movement from an existing retail facility.
that's
to a
correct.
customer.
Yeah, that's correct. And this ability for the retailers and the hybrid and the micro folks to deliver themselves is really just a stopgap until the delivery companies get operational. So eventually they won't have that right to deliver. I guess right now it is sort of the front-facing retail store that can deliver its own product to its own customers, but eventually they'll use this third-party delivery service.
Will the number of those delivery services be limited by the state?
Yes, and I'll touch on that in just a couple of moments. I'll go through the number of licenses that are being offered, when they're offered, how they're offered, etc. So the next license type is the Cultivator license. This is the larger scale grow facility. It's kind of what you think of when you think of a 100,000 square foot building being converted to a grow facility. Anywhere from 15,000 square feet of canopy at a minimum to 250,000 square feet of canopy. So it could be a really quite a substantive operation. They also added in January, the Department of Consumer Protection permitted outdoor cultivation. So that is also an option for these large-scale cultivators. Then you have sort of the mid-stream activities, the production activities, the product manufacturer, the food and beverage manufacturer, and the product packager. So those three license types, are really for someone who's buying wholesale flour or oils, converting it into a final product, and then delivering it or selling it to the retailers to sell on the shelves. Typically you see these licenses sort of stacked in one vertical, and they'll have, the capacity to do all of the operations under one roof. Then the next we talked about delivery services, again, this Uber Eats model. And then the transporter license is really business to business. So it's some company that has outfitted some vans to drive the finished cannabis from the cultivators to the retailers.
Just a quick question on outdoor cultivation. Is our climate good, bad, otherwise for growing cannabis?
Yeah, I mean, there are several outdoor cultivation facilities in Massachusetts currently operational. There's several hemp farms in Connecticut that are operational. It's largely the same plant, only a different, THC content, so a little higher grade plant that's ultimately grown. They can get, usually just one harvest per year, depending on the type of flower that they plant. Could be two, and when they plant, and kind of how they work with the shoulder season, they call it. But yeah, it works. People do it, and it's definitely,
And then it dies off in the winter and has to be reseeded in the spring, or
that's exactly right.
It's not a perennial.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and sometimes, frankly, they don't even plant them directly into the ground. They have, pots that they just lay on the ground, and they grow from there, so they can control the soil a little bit more. Cannabis is a weed, and they actually used to use it to clear fields of, any toxins or anything that they didn't want. So they would throw a ton of cannabis seeds out there, let them grow when the field was going to be repurposed, and when they tore them all up, it was a nice clean soil. So the nutrients and the soil that you grow in is very important, because obviously as a legal program, you have to meet certain testing standards. So you have to know exactly what kind of medium your product is growing in so that you can control, that there's no mold or other sort of toxins that come into the final product.
Thank you.
Yep. So next slide, I covered just a little bit of the timeline of sort of how this process has unfolded and what we're expecting to see. So I'll talk a little bit about the Social Equity Council, but in Connecticut, the legislature put a big focus on social equity in cannabis, and I'll kind of describe what that means towards the end of this. But the Social Equity Council was kind of the starting point for cannabis in Connecticut, because they had to adopt several rules and policies and programs on the licensing side. So they started in August. They worked for a couple of months to develop their policies and procedures. December, January, they had finalized that. And then in February and March, the state opened up the first round of lottery applications for these 9 new adult use license types. Some of those lottery programs closed last week. And then they are sort of cycling on a weekly basis all the way through June 22nd, I think, is when the last one closes. So that licensing process is we're really in the thick of it right now. Then they will draw the lottery winners, and they will approve those folks who've won. Then the winners will go on to file provisional licenses with the Department of Consumer Protection. And once they have that provisional license, then they will be coming out looking for locations, trying to open, go through the local permitting process, coming to you folks. And then they have 14 months from the date of that provisional license being granted to essentially get their facility open. And that's a real timeline that's set forth in the statute. So they'll be working really hard to meet those deadlines.
Does the statute set forth the upper limit of the number of licenses that can be?
It doesn't. It leaves it at the discretion of the DCP. And if you go to not the next slide, but the following. So the next slide is just describing when all of those lottery programs open. They're all open at this point except for the DIA cultivators and the retailers. Those closed last week. The micro cultivator closes tomorrow. But that was the timing that these lottery programs opened. So the following page, this shows you it's a DCP press release. It shows you exactly how many licenses are being offered at the state level. So for retailer, you have 12 total. And the way the state set it up was 50% of those licenses are going to so-called social equity applicants. So 6 to the general public, 6 to the social equity folks. For micro cultivators,
Again, those were arbitrary numbers, not otherwise set forth in the statute.
That's correct. And there was previously and I'll talk about this in a moment, a limit on the number of retailers and micro cultivators that each municipality was able to host based on their population size. But they actually just amended the law to remove that limit. That law hasn't been signed by the governor yet, but it was passed last week by both chambers. So yeah, I don't necessarily need to go through each of these, but sort of the overall concept here is 12 new retail only, 4 new hybrid facilities, and then 4 micro cultivators. Those are kind of the big ticket items, along with the product manufacturing, of which there will be 6. So a very small number of licenses that are offered in this first round. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you have a license, let's say you have a license as a retailer, can you open several locations or just one?
Just one.
So one license per one venue.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And you don't have to identify your venue at initial application time. You actually don't have to identify it until your final license. But yes, that license will be tied to
A space.
the location, right?
Okay.
So, I mean, this is obviously a very small number of retailer licenses, 12, so it could be that there's never a license available in 80% of the municipalities in the state.
Well, so what the DCP has said is that they will likely hold additional lottery rounds as the industry progresses. You know, my understanding is that and obviously I don't work for the DCP, so I'm just going off of what I've learned through the process. But their intention is to sort of open these facilities as they have the sort of appropriate staff, and sort of as they build their staff up, they'll add more licenses and run more lotteries. So that's sort of the idea, is that there will at some point be other rounds of lotteries. But actually, if you flip to the next page, it talks about certain license types that are not subject to the lottery. And this is kind of an important point for what's happening right now. So one of the sort of equity components of this cannabis law was that the legislature gave the existing medical operators sort of an incentive to partner with social equity applicants. And so they said, you folks can go out, partner with a social equity applicant, and open what we're calling an equity joint venture facility. And that's available for any of the license types. And you can do that outside of the lottery. So presumably those 18 retailers and the 4 product manufacturers will each have one or more of these equity joint ventures, which actually happen outside of the lottery. So you could get, another 36 retailers just through that program if each of them were to propose 2 equity joint ventures. So there's a significant, almost, 3 times the number of licenses that they're offering in the lottery could likely be, accessible to the existing medical operators by partnering with the social equity applicants. And the incentive the state gave was, if you partner with these equity applicants and create these equity joint ventures, we will reduce your license conversion fee by half. So it's a significant incentive for these folks to go out, and not only do they get a position in an additional store, but they reduce their conversion fee going from medical only to medical and adult use.
It's not really a lottery, though, is it? I mean, it's more than chance. It's an application process.
Yes, well, the initial piece is a true lottery, and actually,
So you could win. You could be chosen in the lottery and still not get a license if you don't thereafter pass some pre-qualification requirements.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
Isn't that backwards?
Well, it is in some respects, but the concept was to make it not a high burden for folks to enter into the lottery, because in previous, in other licensing regimes across the country, we've seen it's very difficult for someone who may not be as well capitalized as a multi-state operator to come in and find real estate and bring on all their professionals to build out their team and negotiate all their contracts amongst the partners, pay attorneys, yada yada yada. So the concept was, let's have a low barrier to entry, get some folks approved, and then they can go about doing their business to get this project off the ground. So that was the concept. And there are, probably the most important piece is that you pass background checks after the lottery, right? They want to have a deep dive into, making sure you're suitable to hold these licenses. And so, folks that are applying now should know who their partners are and make sure that they qualify under, they're not disqualified by some past criminal activity. And you actually had to attest to that fact in the application. So yeah, that's the process was, let's get some folks licensed, and then they have actually some certainty that they're gonna be able to move forward as long as they can put together the team.
I have one more just little question on the hybrid retailers. So that's interesting that there's this joint venture opportunity, but there's also an element where they could apply it to be through the lottery if they didn't want to do joint venture.
That's
venture?
correct. Yeah, that's
Okay.
correct. The lottery is open to everyone. If there's the limit is if you already hold 2 licenses, you can't win any licenses in the lottery. So most of the existing operators were kind of shut out from the lottery because they already hold several
Okay.
licenses.
Thank you.
The next slide is just showing what some of the application fees were. Probably not particularly germane to this board here. The following slide is actually a snapshot of all the lottery applications that had been filed as of last Thursday. As you can see, 6 lines down, the adult use cannabis retailer, there were 8,357 lottery applications filed for the social equity lottery and over 7,000 filed for the general lottery. So that was, obviously a really high number for 6 licenses under each category. And the social equity folks, if you don't get selected in that 6, your application automatically rolls over into the general lottery. So the general lottery, by the time they pick it, will have somewhere around 15,000 applications to be selected out of 6. And then as I mentioned before, some of the other counts are much lower because they haven't hit yet their final deadline. We saw 2 weeks ago there was I think 2,000 social equity lottery applications. The week before that, there was 130. So people were really, putting all the applications in right up to the very end. So the next slide goes through or starts to talk about some of the local zoning components. So Section 148 of the Cannabis Bill, provides explicit authorization for municipalities to prohibit cannabis establishments or establish reasonable restrictions on the location of those facilities, where they're going to operate, how they're going to operate, sort of your typical zoning standards, which municipalities already have under their regular jurisdiction. This is just a clear delineation of that power under cannabis. Couple of things to note. Section 148C states that if there is no zoning in place or no moratorium or anything directly addressing adult use cannabis, that if the municipality were to receive an application, it would have to treat that application as quote-unquote any other similar use. So you might treat it as similar to a retail store, a liquor store, cultivation facility, to some other manufacturing use. So we have, in fact, seen some municipalities sort of rely on this language and not make any changes to their zoning bylaws and just say, yep, this works under the retail use, as I said, whatever is the most similar use. So that's an important tool for folks to know that they have at their disposal.
I just so this is fascinating. You've also kind of opened up my eyes that we had, I think, been mostly focusing on the retail sale. There's a whole lot of other sort of licenses. Do those all count as establishment, whether it's the food and beverage sort of version or the packaging version or the I guess the extraction, if you're...
Yeah, they can be separate businesses, they're separate licenses. You could have just a product manufacturing business, you could have just a food and beverage business, you could have just a product packager business. Frankly, I'm not quite sure how solid of a business opportunity that particular license type is, but yes, absolutely, they could be they could all be separate operations.
And then a placeholder for, I think, for us to think about is that we may have zoning regulations, let's say, on a catering or a commercial kitchen or others. Or I don't know if we actually do that. For just using the food and beverage as an example.
Yeah.
would they fall under that?
That would obviously be up to the town's discretion. The zoning enforcement officer could make that interpretation, but certainly that would be the analogous use to it.
And do the cultivators or micro cultivators, are they usually treated as sort of industrial, commercial, or agricultural?
More often industrial, but certainly there have been agricultural, some, especially where they're outdoor cultivation operations, they are agricultural. The one important point on agricultural zoning is the statute actually carved out the use of cannabis as a quote-unquote agricultural use. You could still choose to zone it that, but if you had agricultural restrictions on your farm, for example, if you sold the development rights to the state and they put an agricultural easement over it, that would prohibit a cannabis operation unless they change it in the future.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So I highlighted section 148E. This provision, which is the 1 per 25,000, one retail or micro cultivator per 25,000 residents, this provision is now struck from the bill, of course subject to unless the governor vetoes this approved legislation. There is no longer a cap on the number of retailers a municipality can host. And so that's consistent and just with the next page as well. This map on the right-hand side, the DCP came out with guidance saying how they analyzed the 1 per 25,000 rule. And basically what they said was you round up for one facility. So basically every community could have one facility, even if it's less than 25,000 residents. But in order to get to 2, you had to be 50,000 residents. In order to get to 3, you had to be 75,000 residents. And again, this is no longer the law, or presumably it will no longer be the law, but if in the event the bill gets vetoed, this would still apply. Section 148G, which I have on the left of the map, does talk about how the state will look for municipal zoning approval at final licensure. Just an important component of any applicants. So the next piece I want to talk about is some of the other local zoning components. One thing that the legislature explicitly prohibited, which was something we saw a lot of, or we see is actually required by law in Massachusetts, is a host community agreement where the municipalities were essentially entering into contracts with these operators for a certain percentage of their gross sales, somewhat in exchange to allow them to operate there. So the legislature specifically prohibited those types of arrangements, but they did say that a community can charge essentially the marijuana operator up to $50,000 for the first 30 days of being in operation for expenses that are incurred. Like if you need to put a police officer on duty to mitigate traffic issues, you could pass that bill along to the operator up to $50,000. And the other note that I have on this slide, section 126, which specifically authorizes the municipalities to get 3% of the gross receipts of a cannabis retailer, and that's substantive. You could see a retailer doing $10 million in sales. So with that, the municipality would see $300,000. A couple of other points from a local zoning perspective. Continuing on section 83, the voters of a community could ask for a referendum on whether to permit or prohibit cannabis sales. There are certain, requirements to meet that 10% of the voters, and then there's specific instructions on how to run that ballot. And then another piece is the municipalities cannot prohibit deliveries into the communities. So even if you banned cannabis, a delivery company could still deliver a product to the residents of the community. Another point of guidance that came from the Department of Consumer Protection, there was some confusion around buffer zones, so establishing these businesses within a close proximity to schools or any other sensitive uses. The state law does not have any specific buffer zone requirement. So that's a local zoning consideration. And we've certainly seen plenty of communities say, I don't want these within 500 feet of another facility or within a half mile from a school or a church, a park, etc. The next couple of slides I'll be able to flip through. So I have, we've been doing our best to try and track the various moratoriums and bans. So this slide shows all of the, moratoriums. Some of them are, it's not a perfect map because they're changing. People are taking the moratoriums down, etc. But it's kind of a good overview of where they are. It's also not perfect because the moratorium might be only on retail sales, and they could allow other uses but put a moratorium on retail until they decide how they want to handle retail, or they could ban only retail and allow cultivation or some of the sort of back of the house operations. So then on the next slide, I overlaid the existing facilities over all the moratoriums in place, and you can see it's certainly going to be a tough haul for folks to find suitable locations and communities and the right areas. So just a kind of a good visual there. I won't spend too much time on the social equity piece, but just so you folks understand it, again, a big focus on equity in Connecticut, and giving an opportunity to those that were disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs. So to qualify as a social equity applicant, your business has to be 65% owned by someone who has lived for 5 out of the last 10 years, or 9 out of their first 18 years of life, in one of these areas of disproportionate impact, which is defined by the Social Equity Council. And they also have to be below a certain income threshold, their household income. So that's all shown here. And then the equity joint ventures, those are slightly different. They're 50% owned by the existing operators and 50% owned by the equity applicants. The next slide just shows the actual map of the areas of disproportionate impact. Basically, they took unemployment rates and past conviction rates to develop these zones. One other piece here is one of the other license types that we didn't touch on, or one of the other avenues for approving a license that we didn't touch on, is the so-called DIA cultivator license. So one way to get a cultivator license in Connecticut is to create a social equity business, 65% owned by a qualified individual, and then apply, and you can actually go outside of the lottery if you pay $3 million for the license and you locate your facility in one of these areas of disproportionate impact. The next page is just an overview of some of the licensing requirements for the social equity application. Nothing really to note there other than that it's a very thorough overview of the business. One resource that I wanted to point out to folks is the newly formed Connecticut Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. Good source for information. I'm a member and a founder of the Chamber of Commerce, and it was just started several months back, and building its membership, and that's everything I've got. And I didn't mention, I also brought for you guys the municipal authority overview from the state. So this is just kind of covers everything that I talked about, but really only focused on sort of the municipality's role and their authority on licensing and overseeing these establishments. So with that, thank you guys very much for having me. I'll happy to answer questions. And
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Attorney Listman, for the presentation and for the resources, materials. We've been asking questions, but we have open time now for any other questions from our commission members.
I'm wondering if any of the newer legislation coming out had anything to do with product regulation, wherein the quality of the cannabis, like fillers or more dangerous drugs that sometimes get into cannabis, is there any protocols for testing, enforcement of the quality of the cannabis? I'm familiar with situations that didn't work out well because there was something mixed in with the cannabis. Is any of that covered by the new legislation?
You mean the final product, Jeff, or what comes out of the pot?
Well, both.
Both.
I guess what a customer would use, like in a retail situation, if you're gonna use it in a food product, that might be another difference. But
yeah,
is there any regulation around
absolutely.
that? Yeah.
Very lengthy regulations on the amount of what actually shows up in the cannabis plant. Every product has to be tested. All the plants, all the finished product has to be tested in batches, and so there's a very strict, regulatory oversight on what the final product is going to look like, including THC levels, the amount of THC in the finished product. It's one distinction between the medical and the adult use program is there's certain THC limits on adult use, whereas that doesn't exist on the medical side. So, for some folks that may be suffering from cancer, they have higher intensity products as medicine, but that's not allowed on the adult use side. But yes, absolutely.
State will go in and test that, or is it
They'll
self-police?
require that the cultivators and the product manufacturers produce the test results. And they can audit those, and they have to get them. They have to meet a certain standard in order to be eligible to be sold on the open market.
Okay.
What's the Connecticut statute and accompanying regulatory scheme patterned after another state, for Massachusetts, for example?
It's hard to say exactly. I think they pulled a lot from several different states. Certainly the medical program, I think actually Massachusetts modeled some of their rules off of Connecticut's medical program, and I suspect Connecticut looked to Massachusetts as part of their due diligence process for drafting the adult use legislation. But there was also New Jersey and New York were both sort of undergoing a legislative process, and there was a lot of focus, like I said, on social equity, so they were looking at other states on what was successful, what was not successful from a social equity perspective. So I don't know if there was any specific model that they took from solely, but I suspect it was sort of
There's not a uniform cannabis statute.
Not at the moment, no.
Does either your group, the Chamber of Cannabis Chamber of Commerce,
Yep.
or any other group providing sort of model zoning regulations for state like Connecticut? It would seem like something that either you would promulgate or you would offer for free, or maybe I'm just curious. Is that a function of your business as well as of your firm providing that kind of?
We have not historically represented municipalities. We're usually on the applicant side. I did give a presentation to Casio, the Connecticut Association for Zoning Enforcement Officers, together with an engineering and design firm that I work with, Fuss & O'Neill, pretty frequently. And we kind of talked about what are some components to include in a cannabis, zoning bylaw. But I have not developed a model zoning bylaw. I think there are some floating around. I've seen, I think, some being duplicated maybe across some municipalities.
We saw some pretty strongly worded prohibitions, I think, in some of the sample materials that you provided for us previously, Christine, that just kind of paging through, some of them were pretty strident. Thou shall not, and that sort of thing, and others were a bit more specific about timelines and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, you really see a big range. Some bylaws are certainly a little bit more robust than others, especially where it comes to, odor mitigation protocols or things like that. But, for the most part, those sort of more detailed analyses and restrictions, we mostly see that coming in the special permit process, the special exception process, where you can really evaluate a specific project. So, functionally, the more generic bylaw is probably going to be more suitable, as long as you give your boards, this board, presumably the appropriate, authority to impose conditions, et cetera, as needed.
So then, as to the delivery service licensees that are going to be developed, they're going to commence operations presumably at some point in the next couple of years. I assume entrepreneurs or enterprising individuals will start these, and they will go through their own licensing. So will this be like I have an existing DoorDash or a Uber Eats or whatever? It will be like an entirely separate delivery service, or will the Grubhubs and the DoorDashes come in and say, "Why don't you let us handle it? Can we also deliver that?" Because I know you could get like flowers or chocolates or whatever you can get delivered by DoorDash, right?
Yeah.
So presumably you could get that as well, right? I mean, they're established businesses; they've already got a system.
They could,
Okay.
presumably. There's not necessarily any restriction from them entering in the cannabis space, but we have not seen that. There are some sort of national cannabis delivery companies that, had a massive presence on the West Coast, and they're making their way to the East Coast. And so there are some that are out there that, will find their way, I suspect, into Connecticut.
The reason I'm asking is because this was news, as the chairman pointed out, right? This was news to me that there are all these different categories of licenses, and so when you envision writing rules, writing regulations that can encompass, well, you are a retail establishment, and your function, as you've described it and you've applied for the license, is to be a delivery service, and that's it. And that's the limit of what we will allow you to do. And you just also happen to be delivering marijuana, and you happen to have a fleet of cars, or your business office is here in Woodbridge, right? And so we would allow that under a retail use, right? That entity would rent commercial space, apply for the license, get it, etc. But if it's something else, more along the lines of what I think the average person thinks about, which is the growing and the cultivating as the biggest sort of fraught at this point still, I think, for some folks, right? The idea that somebody might actually start a farm and cultivate it. And I think I'm assuming there's plenty of model language for something like that, but I'm wondering if there's model language for the other types of use that are out there, that, the different types of licenses.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's definitely other zoning bylaws that have been put in place that address each specific license type. You don't necessarily have to address each specific license type. You could take sort of a mixed approach where some, like you said, are existing under the current bylaws, and you analogize it to a regular retail use, whereas maybe the more sensitive uses, you have a specific bylaw that treats just those three types as a unique use in the code. But I think certainly you could find some language on all the license types as necessary. But yeah, I think, if there are some that you think are less, controversial, then you could decide to treat those under the existing bylaw. Or you could simply, a lot of municipalities have simply taken the defined terms from the regs, dropped them in, and then set their use table accordingly. You have the 9 new uses plus the 2 existing medical uses, and now you've laid them out in your use table as we're having them in XYZ locations.
And I appreciate the sort of dot map of, we have 169 towns. Is there any sort of broad trends you're seeing in terms of, because I know these aren't 169, I'm guessing it's not 169 dots. So there'll be a group that haven't done anything. Percentage-wise, do you have a sense how many are trying to, or either going all the way to banning everything, who are in the middle, who are doing the moratorium with thoughts to take their time? Because I know there is time as well, which is probably the second part of the question.
Yeah, I think there was an article, I forget who put it out, a couple of months ago that did an analysis of all the municipalities, and I think they said, maybe it was 2/3 of Connecticut municipalities had either enacted a moratorium or a ban, but that number is, it's not really indicative of what's actually happening, because like I mentioned, some moratoriums are just on retail and they allow all the other uses. So, there's definitely several communities, more than a dozen that I know of that have, outwardly accepted cannabis. They've put zoning in place, and there are many more to follow behind that. Most of the communities put moratoriums in place sort of as a stopgap to give themselves a little bit of time to, start looking at cannabis and where they want to have it. But, the trend that we've seen nationally is, there's always a few communities that ban, a few communities that, accept right from the start, and then, the world doesn't come crashing down on community A that allowed cannabis, and so then you see all the surrounding communities saying, oh, you know what, we're missing out on this revenue because everyone's driving to, New Haven to get their cannabis, and we would like to drive some of that business here, and so they, they slowly come along. But yeah, I would say, if I had to guess, at least half of the communities will, and probably more, will allow some form of cannabis use in towns. There's been a very finite number, maybe 10% or so that have outright banned cannabis altogether.
And you mentioned that sort of revenue potential. Can you walk me through that again? That was that section 126. It's a tax, and
Yep.
it goes to the local community and not to the state?
That's correct. It's a 3% tax on the gross revenue that goes directly to the community.
But just on retailers, hybrid retailers, or the micro cultivators?
Just the retail piece.
Oh,
The micro cultivator, presumably, while they if they were doing the delivery piece, but that's in a limited, that's a limited window, if you will, where they're going to have this direct to delivery right.
gotcha.
If that makes sense. They have a right until there are 5 delivery companies to, essentially conduct retail sales. But that's got a finite window on it, presumably. I mean, I guess if no other delivery businesses operate, then they could run.
Other questions?
Just gotta ask this question. Any concern that we should have whatsoever regarding the fact that the federal government has still not officially declassified cannabis? I mean, I know that that's more of a legislature question probably, but is there any reason to think, and I'm not asking you to, as in your necessarily in your, I'm not saying, hey, I'm retaining you for the purpose of asking
Right.
this question, right? But would a town in Connecticut have any reason, right? Because I have the feeling that someone's going to ask me this question on the street,
Yeah.
to think we're putting ourselves at risk by permitting retail sale of cannabis in our town, when in fact the federal government has yet to recategorize it from schedule whatever,
Yeah.
schedule bad to schedule not so bad.
Yeah. No, it's a fair question and a good question. Of course, as an attorney, when I represent my clients, I have a big disclaimer right on the front of the engagement letter that says, FYI, cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, and the government could, if they chose to do so, they could come in and take your business and take your property and, completely shut you down. Obviously, that hasn't happened. Cannabis is legal in, almost 40 states in some fashion. So the reality is it's the federal government has chosen not to enforce their rules. But we have seen some, angry abutters file RICO lawsuits on cannabis companies and name everyone from the state regulatory body to the governments that host the community. Obviously, as a government, you have certain immunities from suits and things like that. So I guess in theory you could get named in a lawsuit, but the ultimate outcome of that, none of these cases have ever actually made it to be litigated, and so they always end up getting dropped. But
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Is there any way of looking up who's applying for these licenses?
I don't believe they have released any of the application lists yet. I would assume that once they, and I'm just guessing, obviously I'm not privy to these conversations at DCP, but I would assume they'll publish the list of the selected winners, at least the entity names that were chosen. But to date, they haven't published any information on applicants, anything like that. So at some point, obviously these are public records once they're submitted to the state. So, if you wanted to dig hard enough, you could look up all 15,000 applications. But I would assume once you are licensed, then you're very formally registered. And there is a list of all the medical operators that exist in Connecticut. You could Google it; it's right up on the DCP's website. So once you're licensed, they'll be there. I presume once you get selected and approved, they will post some of that information. But I'm not yet, to my knowledge.
Other questions? Well, I'm seeing none. Well, going once, going twice. So I will say a huge thank you. This has been definitely very educational. It was exactly, I think, what we had hoped for, is to have.
If we have a question, can we call you?
Yeah, absolutely.
There you go. Just get a little
Absolutely.
of that in there. All right.
Yeah, please.
Since you're at
please
the
do.
chamber, right?
Yep. You could always join the Chamber of Commerce if you'd like. Prorated fees to the end of the year.
All right.
No, but this was definitely very helpful. I'm glad that we have a recording of it as well, and it will definitely help us move forward. Chris, is there anything else we need to do formally with this meeting other than close it?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
You have to say thank you.
I did say
You did
thank
say
you.
thank
That was a very long thank you.
All right. Second.
Any discussion? All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, any
Thank you so
abstentions?
much.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.